They were outcasts, regarded as the dregs of society. They were second-class citizens, thought of with pity and scorn. For much of history, the disabled were stripped of their voice simply because of their conditions. Ignored by policymakers and the vast majority of Americans, the obstacles they faced remained unacknowledged. There were physical barriers that prevented many from accessing bathrooms, public transportation, and buildings. Many qualified individuals were denied employment simply because of the overall prejudice held by employers. Without a way to express their struggles, the disabled could only suffer in silence. The 504 sit-in became the platform that gave the disabled their voice. The national media attention garnered by the protest was a form of communication that resulted in political pressure, led to the passage of future legislation, and created a major ideological shift in society that changed public perception. Throughout history, disabled Americans lacked accommodations and were discriminated against through legislation. There were ugly laws, policies that prevented the disabled from being seen in public. There was government-mandated sterilization, as society viewed them unfit to bear healthy children. And there were laws that forced many of the disabled to spend their entire lives in insane asylums. However, after seeing the success of the civil rights activists from the 1960s, disability rights activists felt that they too could create change. They lobbied Congress, marched on Washington, and demonstrated across the nation in the early 1970s. Their persistent efforts finally yielded the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which finally recognized the lack of accessibility the disabled faced. The act had multiple sections that outlined how federal agencies would prohibit discrimination. One section stood out, Section 504. It prohibited the exclusion of the disabled from any programs and entities receiving federal funding by forcing them to provide accommodations, such as adding ramps and elevators. However, there was a major problem with 504, its lack of regulations and enforcement. Although regulations were drafted, businesses strongly opposed their implementation because costs were estimated to be in the billions. With no real regulations to enforce the act, there was no incentive to accommodate the handicapped. Despite the efforts of the disabled community, the administrations of Nixon and Ford all failed to take action. The act still stood, but the regulations remained unsigned for 4 years, rendering the act useless. However, as a new election approached, the disabled community finally found a presidential candidate that promised to acknowledge their struggles, Jimmy Carter. When he finally took up the presidency, Carter enlisted Joseph A. Califano, the U.S. Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, or the HEW, to review the 504 regulations. Despite Carter's campaign promises, Califano put off signing the legislation because he wanted to weaken the regulations and incorporate loopholes. Once again, the disabled community found themselves forgotten. Rather than waiting, the disabled community set an ultimatum. If Califano did not sign the regulations unchanged by April 4th, they would protest.
We had reached the end of compromise. This was not the first round. And I think the approach of ACCB was, you've got to strike while the iron is hot, while the administration is new, before they get, taken off into other strands and tracks.
When the deadline came, there was no sign of action from Califano. True to their word, on April 5th, 1977, thousands of the disabled in 10 different states converged on the regional HEW offices to participate in sit-ins. For many protesters, conditions in these buildings became life-threatening. To dissuade the occupiers, the HEW prohibited anyone from bringing in any food, medication, or supplies. Phone lines were cut to prevent any outside contact. As a result, the protests fizzled out within a few days. By April 7th, only one sit-in remained, San Francisco. Judith Heumann, the main organizer of the sit-in, watched as her peers across the nation starved out. San Francisco was no different, as the HEW cut off contact to the outside world. However, with Heumann's leadership, they were able to keep morale up and gather enough donations of money and food to continue their sit-in.
They're tired, they're grubby, they're uncomfortable, but their spirits are soaring. The sit-in at San Francisco's HEW headquarters now is in its third day. And 125 disabled and handicapped are pledging they'll continue the sit-in through tomorrow night, if not longer.
As the protests dragged on, San Francisco and leaders such as Judith Heumann became the focal point of the media. Local and major news outlets such as ABC News and the New York Times reported on the sit-in, highlighting the mistreatment of the disabled and rallying the public behind the movement.
I was absolutely blown away by the coverage of the demonstrations. It was front page news. It was a big deal. And it was the first time that I had seen people who use respirators and people who, have severe disabilities being activists and sitting in a building. And it was so impactful to me to see that coverage.
While the sit-in built up more support, the HEW's position remained unchanged. Califano refused to sign the original regulations. HEW officials instead called for a separate but equal clause, mirroring the infamous Jim Crow laws that perpetuated segregation. Participants of the sit-in were unwilling to give in to Califano's added provisions.
I can tell you that every time you raise issues of separate but equal, the outrage of disabled individuals across this country is going to continue. It is going to be ignited. We will no longer allow the government to oppress disabled individuals. We want the law enforced. We want no more segregation.
In order to more directly pressure Califano, Judith Heumann led 24 protesters to Washington, D.C. on April 20th. Once they got to D.C., the group met with 2 senators to discuss their daily struggles. Moved by their stories, the senators gathered 28 colleagues to write letters of support, a major victory for the movement. Riding off the momentum from the senators' support, the group rallied in front of the White House.
Back in Washington today, more than 100 people marched in front of the White House. The demonstrators would be content if Carter would only put pressure on the HEW director, Califano, to sign the Civil Rights Bill guaranteeing the rights of handicapped people.
Faced with overwhelming pressure, Califano finally gave in. On April 28, 1977, Califano signed the Section 504 regulations without compromising on the protesters' demands. 2 days later, the longest non-violent occupation of a federal building finally ended.
New rules will usher in a new era of civil rights that will change the face of America, starting with such things as curbstones at intersections. Programs in virtually every institution that receives government funds must be made accessible to the handicapped within 2 months.
The short-term impacts of the sit-in were revolutionary. Buildings made adjustments to become accessible to all, including installing ramps, elevators, and wider entrances and restroom stalls. Not only did the sit-in create tangible change, it also resulted in a major ideological shift for society. With the support of the national media, the 504 sit-in became one of the first major public acknowledgments of the prejudice the disabled faced. The media attention created from the sit-in became a channel for communication and discourse that helped to destigmatize many of the stereotypes surrounding the disabled, becoming the key to understanding between different groups.
And I think the media is a very powerful tool and can be used and has been used to identify an issue, to get people to understand it, to get to understand people with disabilities and their needs, and to get rid of stereotypes and generalizations.
The long-term effects of the sit-in are mixed. The 504 sit-in paved the way for future disability legislation, becoming the stepping stone for the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which expanded and applied the protections from the Rehabilitation Act to most private sector businesses. However, not everything went smoothly. Many buildings took decades to adhere to the regulations. Many still struggled to find jobs, while others remained in poverty. Violations of disability acts still occur. Still, the successes following the sit-in in 1977 cannot be understated. The nationwide media attention the protests garnered were a demonstration of communication that gave the disabled a platform to voice their struggles. It drew attention to the adversity and obstacles the disabled faced in society, forcing the government to take action and provide legal assistance, while also changing public perception. As the legacy of the 504 sit-in continues, the voice of the disabled will never be silenced again.